This is LA Theater Works. I'm Susan Lowenberg. For most of us, wrapping our heads around chaos theory is as difficult as predicting the future. So we've invited Steven Strogatz to help bring some order to our understanding of chaos. He's a professor of applied mathematics at Cornell University and the author of Nonlinear Dynamics and Chaos. Steven, welcome back to LA Theater Works, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much, Susan. It's a pleasure to be back.
What is chaos?
Well, that's a great place to start. There's the colloquial use of the word. We think of chaos as just randomness or disorder or mayhem. But when a scientist uses the term chaos, it means something a little more subtle. It's got elements of the unpredictable and the disorderly, but it also has mysterious patterns and order within it. So it's a kind of strange state that sits in between order and what you might have traditionally thought of as chaos.
How recent is the concept as we understand it now?
I would say that the first glimmerings of chaos are about 100 years ago in the work of a French mathematician, Henri Poincaré. But then in a sort of a twist that echoes something that happens in the play, his work was lost till about 1960. That is, nobody except a very small group of mathematicians was aware of what Poincaré had done in the late 1800s. And so chaos theory didn't really have any impact at all until about 1960. And then another scientist working on weather prediction sort of rediscovered it in an even more striking form, and yet he too was ignored, and his work was lost. But so neither of them really made their mark, and it was only in about the 1970s or 80s that chaos became a big story in science. And Tom Stoppard, we know, was influenced by the book Chaos that the great science writer James Gleick wrote in 1987.
But why did chaos suddenly become a big story?
I guess the first thing to say is background, that science for so long, and especially physics, has been dominated by the search for order, the opposite of chaos, for patterns and rules. And so we think of the regular side of nature as the thing that physicists especially are interested in studying. And so that blinded people really for centuries since Isaac Newton in the 1600s. For maybe 350 years or so, there was this obsessive focus on the neat and tidy and orderly side of nature. But there was always this sort of nagging feeling that we're missing half the story because there's all kinds of irregularity out there. That's obvious to anybody. There's irregular ups and downs in the stock market. There's wildlife populations, booms and busts, and turbulence in the atmosphere and in the ocean. You know, these things were considered monsters or pathologies that science couldn't really deal with and wanted to sweep under the rug. So what chaos theory did in the 1970s and 80s was say, actually, it's time to stop ignoring all those things. We've got to address them, and finally, we have techniques for addressing them and for understanding them, and they may not be as hopeless as we used to think.
And how did that happen? Was that just pure happenstance, or was there a group of people who were beginning to talk about the importance of interdisciplinary discussion? What was in the air that made all that
so interesting.
possible?
That I think you're putting your finger on it right there. There was something in the air, and these people were all mavericks in their own fields. They were outsiders in the sense that, for instance, Ed Lorenz in weather prediction, a lot of people within the meteorology community said to him, look, give up on that. We all know that you can't really predict the weather. Why don't you work on something more sensible? That's like tea leaves. That's black art. We know that problem is hopeless. But Lorenz was stubborn. And then within geometry, there was a man named Benoit Mandelbrot, who is usually thought of as the father of fractal geometry, who said, and it's actually, there's practically a quote from him in the play when I think it's Thomasina says toward the end that real nature is more irregular, not so simple and Euclidean as we always thought. So there was Mandelbrot saying we've got to pay attention to irregularity in geometry. And what I'm saying is that there were these people who had a taste for the taboo subject of the jagged and the disorderly and the irregular. And somehow they found each other. They realized that they were all thinking about the same thing. They were all thinking about how to make a science out of disorder, out of chaos.
So how does chaos differ from randomness?
That's an excellent question. We do need to talk about that because some people think from the sound of the word that chaos must be part of randomness or probability theory or statistics, all the things that have to do with chance. It absolutely is related to those, but it's not those things because the way that the word chaos is used technically is that it's seemingly random behavior in a system that's governed by deterministic rules. So when I say deterministic rules, I mean, and this is a theme that runs throughout the play, a system is deterministic if its present completely determines its future. That is, if I know where everything is right now and how it's moving, then there are rules that tell me what will happen an instant from now and an instant after that, and I can just march forward through time, moment by moment, into the indefinite future. And so the future would be predetermined by the present. That's, the way Newton's laws work in physics. And we've had this picture now since the 1660s that, that's what our universe is like. If we know where all the particles are and how they're moving, obeying Newton's laws or later Einstein's laws, that we should be able to predict everything. And this is a very scary thought because even though only in principle we could do it, but still, philosophically, it would mean there's no free will. Everything that you could possibly think or do was predetermined by the state of the universe and the state of you and your surroundings at the current moment. You never really had a choice.
So what is the meaning, for example, of Thomasina's untimely death? How can you work backwards from that event and talk about randomness or chaos?
Well, what chaos says now is that even when laws are completely determined and there's no noise, to use a word that also comes up later in the play, there's no source of randomness inherent in the way that things evolve. They just follow a little computer program, you might think. The universe is sort of running like a machine. Even if that were true, says chaos theory, there's still an element of unpredictability. It's inescapable. And the reason is that any slight uncertainties or any little unknown effects at the current time can amplify and snowball so rapidly that things rapidly become unpredictable. That's something, by the way, that we knew forever, really. I mean, that's an ancient concept. There's an old poem from the 1300s that you may be familiar with. It starts, "For want of a nail, the shoe was lost." It's a story about the fall of a kingdom. So it says, because there wasn't a nail, you couldn't put the shoe in the horse. And then because the horse didn't have its proper horseshoe on, it couldn't ride into the battle correctly. And so the battle was lost, and ultimately the kingdom was lost. Mm-hmm. So the point was that just the absence of this one horseshoe nail led to this unforeseen or unintended consequence of a whole kingdom falling down. Now, in the case of Thomasina, in that last scene or near the end, she goes in and she's got a candle because she wants to finally go and kiss Septimus. And he tells her, be careful with that flame. But presumably some little flickering of the flame caught fire with something, and that's it. So it's sort of a case that even if all of that was predetermined, the little flickering of the flame may have been enough to lead to this tragic end. And if it had just flickered a little differently the other direction, wouldn't have hit the curtain and it wouldn't have killed her. That's the universe we live in, unpredictable.
In light of all of that, what would you say is the goal of chaos theory?
Well, chaos theory has these two sides to it. The negative side of chaos, if you like, is the one that sounds like its name. It's to say that even much simpler systems than human affairs or wars or people in love, we knew that those things are unpredictable. We've known that forever. You might say there's nothing new in chaos theory. That's not news to tell me that little things can cascade and snowball and create unpredictability. It's true, we have known that forever. But what's new about chaos, and this is the negative side of it, is that this kind of unpredictability infects even systems that we thought we did understand, like something as simple as the swinging of a pendulum back and forth, the monotonous pendulum that's supposed to put people to sleep or hypnotize them. Even that, if you just jiggle it the right way, can become unpredictable. And that was not supposed to happen. Isaac Newton and his like thought that, we had at least solved for the motion of pendulums. And now in 1970 and 80, we're finding out even those paradigms of order turn out to have disorder lurking in them. So the downside of chaos is that we're seeing unpredictability even in the things that we thought we had mastered. But the positive side of chaos is that there are certain things that look random that are not, that actually have subtle structure in them. That is, we're starting through chaos theory to have new eyes for disorder, new ways of seeing pattern within chaos that was not classical, totally new kinds of patterns that no one had ever expected were there, never even thought of. That offers hope. For instance, something like an arrhythmia of the heart, which doctors usually think of as just wild, irregular beating, there might be a kind of pattern in it that could allow us to design better defibrillators, for example.
So this is fascinating. In a sense, what you're saying is you really can apply chaos theory across all disciplines.
Exactly. It expands our repertoire of patterns. That is, this is the theme in the play about landscape architecture, whether it's the classical beauty of Arcadia or this new romantic style of picturesque, where it's supposed to look very decadent, but in fact there's new kinds of patterns there, just that the classical eye doesn't see them. It's not the absence of pattern, it's new pattern. So Thomasina touches on that when she says, can't I make a leaf? Why do I have to be confined to these simple circles and lines in geometry? Or she says, if there's a curve for a bell, why isn't there a curve for a bluebell or a rose? And Septimus says, well, there isn't. But she invents a new way of doing geometry so that there is. That's all real. That has really happened. I mean, it didn't happen in the 1800s. That's a conceit of the play. But it did happen in the 1970s. People were finding ways to find new structures that were not the classical geometric structures, and then to use those for all kinds of practical purposes. For instance, people who have epileptic seizures. It's a very serious problem for them because they don't necessarily know when they're going to have one. And so if they're giving their baby a bath and suddenly have a seizure, it's very dangerous. The kid is in the bath without a parent there. So if an epileptic person can be told ahead of time, you're about to have a seizure or you're going to have one in 10 minutes from now, that person could, lie down or take the kid out of the bath or whatever. Well, people are now using chaos theory to produce brainwave detection systems. That is, a person can have a fairly non-invasive thing recording their brainwaves, which tells them this is now the signature, a precursor of an impending seizure. And with pretty good predictability, they get it right using chaos math. I mean, it's being used to design space missions. You can get to the moon with much less fuel than we ever thought possible using chaotic trajectories to get us there. See, it's a very radical paradigm shift because a NASA engineer doesn't like the idea of sending a very expensive spacecraft on a chaotic path to the moon. That sounds dangerous. But it can actually, if done right, save a lot of money. It costs $100,000 per pound of stuff you send into space. So if you can do it a lot more cheaply, that is, make things lighter, the fuel weighs a lot. If you can get by with a lot less fuel, you're saving NASA a lot of money. I mean, I could go on and on. It's useful in every branch of science and technology that we know.
Well, getting back to the play and what was real and what was a conceit, is Tom Stoppard true to the history of chaos theory? In other words, are the discussions of chaos theory in the play consistent with mathematical knowledge at the time, both in the world of the play in the 19th century and in the present?
No, he's not. He's not at all. And I don't feel too concerned about that because the play, I mean, aside from being a great play and very emotionally poignant and funny and everything, I mean, it's a fantastic play, dramatically speaking, but scientifically speaking and mathematically, it's fantastic too because he gives some of the best explanations of the core ideas of chaos theory that you can find anywhere, better than in textbooks. I'm not just saying that to flatter him. I'm astounded at his level of understanding and insight and the pithy way he expresses the key ideas of chaos. So that part is magnificent, but it's not historically accurate at all. To say that in the 1810 or thereabout, yes, that the early scenes take place, there is no evidence that anyone at that time had any of the understanding that Thomasina had. As I say, the first work in chaos that we know of is about something like 1890 or thereabout by this Henri Poincaré in France. On the other hand, he gets something qualitatively right. Stoppard does when he says there's that whole bit about the Thomasina complains how terrible it is that the Alexandrian library, all that knowledge has been lost. And Septimus says, well, it's whatever, it'll come back. Knowledge is never really lost. It comes back. There's some element of that in the history of chaos theory and in the play. That is, what Thomasina discovered was lost and then rediscovered in the era of Valentine and Hannah when they're talking about contemporary times. Well, the same was true. Poincaré's work in the 1890s and 1900s was lost for about 60 years until rediscovered by Lorentz, and then that was lost for another 10. So this does happen.
Yeah, and I was just thinking about the fact that there's also the element of being ready to accept a discovery. Sometimes the world, it's too early. The surrounding conditions, I think, of accepting certain kinds of new knowledge have to be right.
Well, that's such an interesting point, and you could be right. And so for that matter, Stoppard could be right. I mean, part of the play is about the mysteries of history. That is, what things are lost and we don't know about it. So we do know from the historical record in the development of chaos theory that there were things, for instance, that were exactly like what you just described, where people were not psychologically ready to see what they were literally seeing. That is, I'm thinking here of a case of engineers in the 1920s, electrical engineers working in the early development of radio, who were listening to some of the electrical circuits they had built, and they heard a strange hissing sound, which they, it sounds like noise or static of some kind. They didn't know what it was. And in fact, they were hearing the sound of chaos, and they reported that they heard this strange hiss, but they thought there was something wrong with their circuit and, didn't make much of it. But they weren't psychologically ready to see, or in this case, to hear what they were actually hearing. And so they heard it, but it meant nothing to them, and so it wasn't followed up. I mean, this happened repeatedly in the development of chaos, that people would see things that were later realized to be true manifestations of what is now recognized as modern chaos, deterministic chaos, and they just ignored it, even though they saw it.
When did real-life mathematicians start thinking seriously about the idea of representing nature through algorithms?
That's a parallel development to chaos theory, this question of algorithms and iteration. In the late 1800s, mathematicians, for their own reasons, started to worry about algorithms and iteration, repeating an operation over and over, and they produced what at the time seemed like monstrous, bizarre shapes, totally different from anything in classical geometry, not smooth, not undulating and gentle, really jaggedy-looking, strange shapes that we now think of as fractals. But they were creating these for reasons internal to math, that is, to produce counterexamples, that is, examples that would show that certain intuitive things were false. Certain things that people thought had to be true, these monstrous counterexamples showed, well, they're not always true. And you could create these weird counterexamples through algorithms and iteration.
Can you give us an example of that?
Well, sure. There's an example when around the turn of the 20th century, there was a big debate within math. What do we mean by a curve? That is, we know what a straight line is, and we know what a circle is. So think of a thread, you can think of bending a thread or a piece of rope into a shape of any kind of curve you want. That's what people think a curve is. It's some kind of path followed by a string or a rope or something. So then the question was, is that really what we mean by a curve? For instance, could a curve bend back on itself so much that it fills up every point in a square area? Like it can go through every point in a two-dimensional region. It turns out you can. If you make a weird enough fractal thing called a space-filling curve, you can fill 2 dimensions or 3 dimensions or any number of dimensions just with a curve. So mathematicians created these weird examples, and no one knew what to make of them. They were described as unnatural. This was my point, that these things were described at the time as completely unnatural and freakish. And this is the great irony. It turned out that about 70 years later, when fractal geometry started to be invented, that these were exactly the things that were natural. It was these weird iterations and algorithms that led to the best descriptions of mountains and coastlines and leaves and ferns and trees and all the things that are totally natural. They're much more like these weird objects than they are like cones and cylinders. So Thomasina says, why am I studying all the geometry that has to do with manufactured things? Where's the geometry of real things, of natural things? And, Septimus doesn't know. There is no geometry at that time, but that's fractal geometry. But what's so funny is that it was called Baroque and bizarre and unnatural, and it's exactly the opposite. It's the most natural kind of geometry. I mean, if you want, this is the same theme that's happening in the landscape with Sidley Park. It's being changed from its classical landscape, which is much more Euclidean and manufactured, to this supposedly naturalistic thing.
When Thomasina makes her initial hypothesis, it's the year 1809. How long did it take mathematics to catch up with her?
Well, I'd say about 90 years. It's really the turn of the 20th century. And then those people at that time, the Poincaré and his disciples, were the Thomasinus, the real Thomasinus. And they were... Now, Poincaré was known as one of the world's great mathematicians, so he was not obscure in the way that we have to think of Thomasina as obscure. But nevertheless, his work was not picked up. It was a backwater. It was not the direction that science or math was going. You know, the turn of the 20th century was the era in science, of the Albert Einstein and relativity theory, and then 20 years later, quantum mechanics. So those were the big stories in physics for the 20th century. And to work on classical things like Newton's laws and finding strange disorder in Newton's laws, that was really retro. I mean, people thought, come on, Newton's laws that's been picked over for 200 years. We're not doing that anymore. But yet Poincaré did find something shocking in there, but no one could see it. No one could really even understand what he was saying.
One of the unusual aspects of Arcadia is that it presents a layman mathematician in the play, in the person of Valentine Coverley. Is Valentine credible? Does he explain the concepts well?
I find Valentine completely credible because he's a graduate student, is the way I would see him. His explanations are magnificent. I mean, they're really spot on. They're very poetic. I would be happy and proud to be able to explain things that well in any class I've given.
Well, except that I think that he didn't think of himself as a professional. I mean, he thought of himself as an amateur.
I guess so, because he's a member of the family, so he's looking at the game books for those hundreds of years, well, maybe 180 years, whatever it is. To me, he reminds me of I was a graduate student at the time that chaos was just getting big. So maybe I identify with him because what he was trying to do with those grouse population numbers and trying to find a pattern in the ups and downs of how many grouse were shot over the years, that was a lot like what I was trying to do. I was trying to look at patterns of human sleep-wake cycles and use chaos to figure out rules about our sleep rhythms.
Did you succeed?
Well,
or were you in Valentine's position? Are you empathizing?
I was a little more
him?
in his position. I think I did. I empathize with him because, as he says, there's too much noise. There were too many contaminants polluting his data. That was something a lot of young people were doing in the 1980s, trying to apply chaos theory to all kinds of things where people had not seen patterns before and trying to look at it through the lens of this new theory and suddenly extract something magnificent. And in a few cases, they did. I just didn't happen to be one of them, and neither
was Valentine. So let's just sort of go deeper into this and try to understand it. He basically gives up because he comes to realize that calculating grouse populations in reverse is impossible. Why is it impossible?
There's a few things that could be working against him or against anyone who's trying to do something like what he tried to do. The cases where this trick has worked, where chaos has been successful, he mentions that with goldfish it would be easy. So what does he mean?
Yes, what does he mean?
I think he's describing a case where you imagine like very idealized a little pond with the goldfish, and how many goldfish there are now will determine how many there will be, next week or next year. Maybe because there aren't any predators in the pond. It's just the goldfish and what little food they can eat. It's a super simple ecosystem, is I think what he has in mind. So the grouse, I think the problem is supposed to be, doesn't he say something about if the heather was burned, it messes up? Is it that same speech?
He's trying to talk about all of the different factors, what he calls noise.
Yeah, so noise here means, Stoppard says it very well, that you're trying to pick out the tune, that there's all this background noise and you're trying to find the pattern. So in science, what this would mean is that there's a simple rule that governs how many grouse there are this year, determines how many there are next year, but that rule is obscured because there's all kinds of fluctuations from weather conditions and the condition of the land because of humidity or how much rainfall or I don't know, whatever, migration things or some other predator that you didn't factor into your problem. So all of those things make the problem much harder than, as you say, the enclosed little self-contained system of the goldfish. Maybe I should just say, in case anyone out there listening is wondering about it, just how successful, if you're going to be a real hard-boiled skeptic and say, why haven't I heard of great successes of chaos theory? Have there been any really thunderously great successes? I would say that's fair skepticism. It was a field which was hyped and maybe overhyped. That is, we thought, or some people claimed, that it would be more successful than it turned out to be. The reason it has been not as successful as was once hoped is this issue of noise. That is, the world is more complicated than chaos theory can handle. Even something called chaos theory is not up to the complexity of the real world.
Another aspect of chaos theory that you've written about is the so-called butterfly effect. Could you explain this concept?
Well, the butterfly effect is the poetic way of trying to describe the idea that little things can make a big difference. So you're supposed to imagine in the parable that a butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil is creating enough of a change in the air currents that it ultimately leads to a tornado in Texas. So this is another version of the horse and the nail leading to the downfall of a kingdom. That little changes can have these propagating effects that get magnified over and over and can make all the difference.
So how do you see the butterfly effect at work in Arcadia?
The three little items that are put in the book
Yes.
That are then later discovered 180 years later, and there's caused so much confusion about who actually was shooting who in the duel or who was giving the perpendicular poke to who in the gazebo.
Well, I think that's the perfect example because you see Septimus. Septimus puts something in the book. He lends the book to Byron. And our professor makes some assumptions about Byron based on his assumption of what he thinks happened.
Well, I mean, what I was thinking there is just whether this piece of paper, makes it into the book or not. Changes our interpretation of Byron one way or the other based on whether this one little sheet of paper or two or three make it into the book. Right. There are other cases, too, I suppose. He probably has dozens of these throughout the play. There must be critics who spend their life working on all the instances of chaos theory in the play.
Well, I'm so sorry this conversation is coming to an end. It has been absolutely fascinating. And thank you so much, Steven Strogatz, for speaking with us today.
Well, thank you. It's been really a lot of fun.
I've been speaking with Steven Strogatz, the Jacob Gould Sherman Professor of Applied Mathematics at Cornell University and the author of Nonlinear Dynamics and Chaos. This is LA Theater Works.